There is nothing so wonderful in the world as telling stories.
Tous les matins, on essaye de traverser le miroir et de regarder le monde différemment.
It is true, I am a woman. Une fois que ce saut est fait, tout devient possible.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Casiraghi. Welcome to the podcast of Les Rendezvous littéraires Rue Cambon, a place where we meet to talk about writing, to talk about books. Let's meet women writers who have just taken their first step, the most decisive, the most difficult in the world of literature. How did their vocation call to them? What are their writing rituals? Who reads them and what do they read?
I'm Erica Wagner, and it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Min-Sterling and welcome her to Chanel's podcast, Les Rencontres. We're here to discuss Michelle's remarkable debut novel, Camp Zero, a powerful feminist dystopian thriller. It's set in the year 2049. Temperatures are rising, and the United States is scorched by wildfires and threatened with drought. Everyone is implanted with a flick at birth. Imagine your phone and more settled in the skin just behind your ear, continuously feeding information straight to your brain. The wealthy have sequestered themselves in luxurious communities just offshore, called floating cities. The climate emergency is a problem for the poor. But in Canada's far north, a new settlement is founded by the visionary architect who built the floating cities. A young woman, whom the reader at first knows only as Rose, heads up there in search of a better life, but everything, as we will discover, is not as it seems. As Rose's trajectory unfolds, the reader sees the way in which everything changes and yet everything stays the same, as the earth is stripped of its resources and women resist the subjugation of men. It's hard to characterize the novel as dystopian near-futurism when it reads more like a chronicle of the present, wrote David Moscrop in The Globe and Mail. It is, he continued, a study of how people behave in crisis. It's a settler colonial critique of North America. It's an exploration of racialized identity and gender and sexuality. It's a novel full of anxieties and warnings, expressing a frustration that ought to resonate. We learn so little, despite every opportunity to do so. It is also, I will say, a rich and thrilling read. The London Times called it a page-turner with a conscience, and I heartily agree. Michelle was born in British Columbia, Canada, and now lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she teaches literature and writing at the Berklee College of Music. She has been awarded fellowships by the Leighton Artists Colony at the Banff Centre for the Arts and Creativity, by the Institute of Advanced Study, Central European University in Budapest, and has been a fiction fellow at the Virginia Centre for the Creative Arts. Her work has been translated into 10 languages. I'm so delighted to be speaking to her today on Les Rencontres. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you about this marvelous novel, but I'd like to start by asking about your beginnings. As a writer, you grew up in Canada. Tell me a little bit about your childhood and how you started out on your artistic journey.
I've always been a huge reader. I was one of those children who went to the public library every weekend and spent hours browsing the shelves, picking up genre fiction, literary fiction, and whatever it was sort of that was there. And I think a lot of my sensibility of myself as a writer came through the sense of exploration. I grew up on Vancouver Island. It's an island separated from the mainland. And I always had this sense that while there were interesting narratives and stories happening in the place that I lived, that there was this other world that existed beyond the perimeters of my own life and reality. And books always offered an opportunity to both escape, to learn, to travel, and to understand. So my sense of myself as a writer happened through that kind of reading. And then when I started actually writing, I was amazed. I think I was a teenager. I was in grade 9, and we had to do these typing exercises. This was during the 90s. And I remember you just sort of wrote repetitions of things, right? You know, like learn how to type in this manner. And I started typing my own story. And it was this kind of a eureka moment where I felt as if like a window was opening in my soul, where I was like, oh, I can actually use this tool of writing as opposed to just straight typing in order to begin to kind of unspool an imaginary space or begin to understand the world I lived in through narrative as well. And so I became very interested in writing around that period. I guess I was 14 years old and continued. I started writing a little bit of poetry, moved into short stories, but always really wanted to work in the novel form because of its expansive capacity and ability to contain a lot of different types of characters and places and settings, but also conflicting ideas within one space. So Camp Zero was an opportunity to dive into the form and really use it as a way to test out different ideas.
I love that sense of going rogue within a secretarial context. I think that's a tremendous story. Were there challenges, though, in choosing an artistic vocation? It's not always the easiest path to follow.
I was lucky in the sense that my parents were always very encouraging of a kind of artistic journey for me. It wasn't something that I felt I had to really advocate for. I think it was pretty clear from a young point that I always wanted to write. And they were very supportive of that. So at 17 years old, I moved to Montreal from Western Canada to study creative writing. And that was something that really resonated with me because it gave me this opportunity to move to a larger city that had an incredible arts and literary and music scene, but also a place to accrue more experience as well. I feel very blessed that books were something that I could pick up off the shelf in my house. I remember reading my father's paper, like really worn paperback version of like Hermann Hesse. There was some aspect of it that was part of my upbringing, but also I was able to discover on my own terms as well. When I went off, neither my parents are artists or writers, but they really respected it as having a kind of integral and important role, not only society, but in terms of my own life too.
As I said in my introduction, this book has been described as dystopian, but it seems very connected to the present. I know you teach dystopian fiction at Berkeley, and I wondered if there are any texts you've looked to for inspiration and discussion. I was thinking of some of the books I've read and loved. Omar El Akkad's American War, which is set in the aftermath of a second American Civil War. Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, which was published in 1993 and amazingly now was set in 2025, which is just a year from the present, of course. And then there's your fellow Canadian Margaret Atwood and her remarkable Mad Adam trilogy. Can you talk about how you read and interpret this literature?
Absolutely. I love all three of those authors and those novels that you mentioned as well. I think particularly Parable of the Sower, that was a novel that was incredibly influential for me as I was writing Camp Zero. And I think one of the interesting aspects of these really canonical and foundational dystopian texts is how they take a present moment or a present imaginary, unspool it into the future and pick one particular path and imagine it. One of the aspects of dystopian literature that appeals to me is if there's a kind of utopian element that's built into it. For example, in the class I teach at Berkeley, we look at dystopian and utopian texts simultaneously. Out of all of the authors who I've read closely and thought about, Ursula K. Le Guin probably is the author who has the audacity and clear-eyed vision to imagine utopian possibilities out of very difficult circumstances. So a novel, and then the relationship basically between utopia and dystopia. A novel like The Dispossessed, for example, has been really, really illuminating for me to think through these physical spaces in which utopia exists in the dystopian underbelly. Another novel that I was really inspired by is Severance by Ling Ma. This is a novel that is set in a kind of imagined post-pandemic America. And it's also a story about immigration and It's a kind of bildungsroman in the sense it's a story about a young woman finding herself in a really intense post-apocalyptic environment, but it's also quite funny and wry. And I think novels that also touch upon the experience of living as a minority in the U.S. were also elements of thinking about when I was writing Camp Zero, too.
Tell us about the publication process for Camp Zero. How did you find your agent and publisher, and how was that experience for you?
I started working with my agent, who's based in the UK. Her name is Sophie Lambert, fairly early in the experience. I had been living in southern Germany. I had a lengthy literary writing residency at this place called Academy Schloss Solitude. And I wrote the entirety of the first draft of Camp Zero during that period. I was looking at the book and I was like, okay, I'd been living in kind of isolation with a group of 30 other artists and writers in this multidisciplinary art institute on the edge of Stuttgart. So that feeling of isolation that's really prominent and present in the novel was something I had experienced myself. And after I finished that draft, I started thinking about, well, I'd like to eventually revise this and sort of send it out to readers. So I met Sophie that way, and I worked very closely with her and my American agent, Erin Harris, through a process of revision. But it took a while, actually. It wasn't like one of those situations where I wrote the book. It was, sent off to editors. I had a book deal immediately. It was a longer process of figuring out some of the larger narratives and the way the narratives sort of nest together. It's 3 separate strands, and that was something that took a lot of time to figure out how they would come together and converge at the end of the novel. So I worked closely with my agents thinking through some of the editorial questions. And then when the book was sent out, I was very lucky to find very enthusiastic editors in the UK and the US and Canada at the same time. And we worked together as a team, basically, to revise the novel and prepare it for publication.
That sounds like a very positive and collaborative experience.
Yeah, it was nice to get notes and thoughts from readers that I really trust, I think, because I tend to work in isolated conditions in the sense that I'm just like in my office, reading, writing. And as everyone always talks about, writing can be so solitary, right? It can be you just spending so much time in your own head, devising these relationships, these characters. And I'm also really interested in world building and setting as well. There's a tension between being alone and then suddenly having to show your work to people. And so I was very lucky I had professional readers who had a sense of what I was interested in, what I wanted to explore, who I could turn my work to.
Would you read us the first page of the novel?
Absolutely. The Blooms receive their new names on the shortest day of the year. 6 women in total, all strangers. They stand in an empty parking lot and wait to be checked in. Snow has scrubbed the landscape clean, capped the roof of the rundown mall that is one of the few buildings still standing on this frozen stretch of highway. The Bloom last in line pauses to appreciate the freeze. It's colder in the north than she expected, and the snow is more delicate. She takes off a glove and watches a flake vanish in the palm of her hand. She's never seen snow before, and the snowflake feels refreshing on her skin, like a cool cloth pressed to a feverish forehead. When she reaches the entrance to the mall, her new madam introduces herself as Judith. She is nothing like the Bloom's previous madam, who drifted around in a linen kaftan and calfskin sandals. Judith wears a fur-lined parka, black snow pants, and a pair of steel-toe boots, as if she was hired to demolish the dilapidated mall they're standing in front of. Judith reads off a clipboard. Your name will be Rose. Rose, she repeats. A cloying, sentimental name. Like a grandmother who keeps apple pies in the deep freeze. She'd expected one of the pseudonyms shared among the Asian girls in the Loop where she used to work. Jade, May, Lotus. It never mattered the names were cliché or that she is white as she is Korean. Back in the floating city, ethnicity was a ready-made brand.
Thank you so much. Now, tell us a little bit about how Camp Zero arrived for you? I've read that it sprang in part from a visit to a relative in Alberta in northern Canada some while ago. What struck you about what you saw there?
The seed for the novel was rooted in this visit that I took. I went to visit a cousin of mine who was working as a pipe fitter in the oil industry. And this was about over a decade ago. It was during a period in which I think a lot of our conversations about this prominence of fossil fuel extraction and our dependence on it and decarbonization weren't quite at anywhere near the sort of tenor that they're at right now. And so this whole region really was full of workers and people who were basically going there to find work, make money. And there was a huge amount of activity in the area. And I was really interested in that. He was based out of this small town that was close to a lot of oil rigs. And there was this sense in this town of rapid activity. There was a lot of tract housing that was being built. There were a lot of men who were coming in on buses and cars and trucks and everything in order to work. And with every boom comes a bust. And that was sort of the point where I was like, well, eventually this town will no longer look this way. What could it potentially look like in the future, particularly if fossil fuel extraction no longer happens and becomes banned like it is in the novel? So I started thinking through the lens of a post-fossil fuel world, but rooted within the remnants and the kind of ghost town of an oil region. And because I was thinking about all these workers who were arriving, who were gravitating towards this place for jobs, for income, for subsistence, I began to imagine this new wave of workers who might come for different reasons as well. The page that I read is really about showing this new group of workers who are there, who are motivated, I think, in some ways by similar reasons that workers now would gravitate towards an oil region, which is to work, to make money, but also within this post-oil climate catastrophe future, are also leaving behind a very different kind of legacy in the U.S. And a kind of ongoing legacy in Canada as well.
As you've just said, there's a lot of men in these working environments, mining and oil drilling. But in Camp Zero, of course, there are groups of women, and Rose is one of the blooms, as you call them, sex workers who service the men in this environment. And then there is also another group of women, known as White Alice, who are there to monitor environmental changes. What did it mean to imagine women in these environments?
It was really the core of what I wanted to explore in the novel. I knew that there would be male characters and that there is a way. One of the strands does follow a young man named Grant Grimley. But I knew that this heart and emotional motor of the novel would come from groups like these two groups of women. And I was really interested in exploring agency and collectivity and connection between groups of women as well. But I wanted to contrast these experiences and show some similarities that formed, but also some pretty stark differences as well, so that there was a larger amplification of these types of spaces, so that it wouldn't just be one version, that this is it, that there's a flexibility and tension that was produced through those comparisons. And I was really interested in thinking about what kind of solidarities would form too. A lot of the plot tension in Camp Zero comes through these seemingly separate groups of people who are working within this mysterious building project in northern Canada, and how their ambitions, their desires, and their hope for a better future become compromise or change in some way because of the stark realities of the living conditions environmentally and physically, and I think also socially and politically as well. So we see these two spaces, they're quite separate, but eventually in the novel, towards the end, they converge. That was also a dramatic and plot decision, which is like, okay, so these are totally separate living conditions, physically separate, but also separate in terms of background and context. How will they eventually come together in the end? And can a potential solidarity or dissolution take place? I think the novel toys with that.
What kind of research did you do for this book? I'm a little afraid, I have to say, that you didn't have to do too much, because I'm thinking, for instance, of the Canadian wildfires of 2023, which affected so much of the country, and there are wildfires burning now. So talk about how you integrated what's going on in the present with your imagination of the not too distant future.
I think one of the challenges when writing near future narratives is the present always catching up with that future. When I originally wrote this book, I had thought of it as 2039. But by the time it actually was published, I realized that 39 was too close. I needed to punt it by 10 years to 2049 to have a little bit more of a separation between the events in the novel and our present moment. But I think I chose to really ground the book in a lot of the concerns and anxieties that we experience today and think about. Those wildfires, that was something that I would experience when I would visit my family in Alberta, that there were these ongoing wildfires. There's wildfire season, smoke season, and that you wouldn't be able to go outside during the day because the wildfire smoke was so horrific, and that the environment looked completely different, and that was something you needed to contend with on a daily basis. In Camp Zero, I think it's referred to as wildfire season in the novel. And so a lot of the research just came from looking up at the world around us and taking those details, unspooling them, extending them into a 27-year period. But I was also interested in the historical precedent of U.S. and Canadian collaboration in the North. So I did some reading around some Cold War projects that took place that took place during the 50s and 60s that were a joint collaboration by the U.S. and Canadians to build a line of radar stations as a stopgap deterrence against Soviets potentially launching bombers across the Arctic Circle. This was a massive infrastructure project. It cost huge amounts of money. It was called the Distant Early Warning Line. And I was so seized and interested in this idea of building a physical space, like a station, to detect an incoming threat. All of these stations have been decommissioned after the end of the Cold War. They actually still are, a lot of them are in ruins and rubble and still remain. But I wanted to imagine one of those continuing. And as opposed to being a group of men living there, there would be a group of women. And instead of detecting Soviet threat, it would be detecting the threat of the climate and taking something very physical, very much rooted in the past, thinking it through a series of conditions and possibilities, and then subverting it somewhat. So instead of men, it's women. Instead of bombs, it's the climate crisis, and imagining a kind of potential utopia that could form out of these really constrained living conditions.
Rose's mother is Korean. And I would say my experience as a reader is that in the beginning of the novel, she's pulled away from this aspect of her identity, but she's also drawn to it, as we see through the course of the book. What does this aspect of her character mean for you and for the story of the novel?
I think a lot of the novel is about people trying to find home, and home is very broadly defined. One of the points I was interested in exploring is how home can be something that you create, something that you're born into, or something that you seize. And Rose, she's had pretty difficult conditions growing up in coastal New England. The climate has increased to the point where coastal ravages have brought in these very devastating hurricanes, and her mother, they tend to these summer vacation cottages that in the past had typically been places that people would go to vacation. But now, of course, since the weather's changed so much, that's become more compromised and more difficult in some ways. And so for Rose, home has never been a physical space in the way that some people think of home as like, well, it's a house or a city or a street. I think home for her has always been her mother. And when her mother becomes displaced by one of these hurricanes and loses everything and has to go to what's referred to as the dispossession estates, which is a temporary housing, Rose was really faced with a decision, like, how can I maintain my home? How can I take care of my mother? And part of that is also her complex relationship to her mother's a Korean immigrant, so to South Korea as well, feeling the sense of intimacy with it, but also distance. And so it becomes the emotional backbone for her, which is she has to go to this place, northern Canada, in order to provide for her mother. She's going there to spy on this architect. She's sent by a really powerful and influential client, but she wants to get back to her mother, back to her home in order to provide for her. Whereas there's another character named Grant Grimley who basically is trying to flee his family. He never wants to return. And so I was interested in thinking about how language, but also our own cultural traditions, even food is something that's really prominent in the novel, either really delicious food or really bare bones and kind of basic food, but how food becomes like language of love as well. And I think it really is for her and her mother in this book.
Let's talk a little bit about your routine. What does your writing day look like? And do you have any rituals or practices that help you as you're there in that stage of being by yourself?
I do. I mean, I don't have any rituals like rub a crystal 3 times and like recite an incantation, but I do some sort of basic things that I think a lot of writers do, which is I block out the internet, hide my phone and that kind of thing, kind of get it under the membrane of story, basically. But for Camp Zero, because I was teaching full time, I couldn't carve out daily time to work on the book. So I would do these intensive 3-night or 4-day retreats where I would stay in a motel north of Boston and just bring 2 bags of Trader Joe's groceries and basically be there without internet, no connection, a sort of enforced off-grid experience, and do these intensive, immersive writing jaunts. And I found that to be the most effective way for me to break through any kind of obstacles I would experience, plot-wise or character-wise. That if I was able to just go away with these characters for a few days and be with them entirely, it was enough to propel me to the next stage. Since publishing this book, I'm working on a new novel, and I'm every single day with the book in the morning. And then in the evening, I try to do reading as a way to bring me back into the narrative of the novel the next day, too. And that's been pretty effective as well.
And how does your teaching intersect with your writing? I wonder perhaps what you learn from your students.
I learn a lot from them. I give a shout out to my students and say Utopia, Dystopia class and acknowledgements in my book. And it's very from the heart, very authentically felt. There are a lot of different generations that are represented in Camp Zero. And I'm really interested in that, the idea of sort of intergenerational linkages and learning from people who are both younger than us, but also feeling somewhat beholden because I write near future narratives. Like when I think of the future 2049, I'm really thinking of my students, like that's their future to inherit. When I started writing this book, I was quite a bit more pessimistic than I am now. And just through conversations with my students about some of the texts we were studying, but also about trying to cultivate utopian imaginaries, I really became much more open to the possibility of collectively creating better futures, but also understanding them in different ways. And I feel that there's a sense of accountability that's been instilled in my writing practice. None of us are atomized. We all sort of exist within larger connections, larger communities. Even though writing can be quite solitary and you're alone with your thoughts and a book, there are these other connections that ping out depending on who you're in conversation with too. I teach at a music school, so they're all musician artists, and they have very interesting, surprising ways to think about literature. That's also been really interesting and inspiring.
We'll now move on to talking a bit about the reception of your book, what happened when it came out into the world. And I wonder how you feel readers and reviewers have responded to your themes connecting to the destruction of the planet and to the role of women in the story. What struck you about those responses?
It's been interesting to hear from readers, to see what aspects of the novel have resonated, because I think a lot of readers have picked up on sort of climate crisis aspect of it or the gender elements that are in the novel. But one of the things that actually has been surprising is the technology element. You mentioned earlier that one of the plot points of the novel is the flick, which is this embedded technology that humans receive at birth that allows people to be constantly and simultaneously online in the real world. And part of the critique of that is, well, if you're always online, are you more aware of the physical ramifications of the environment? Are you able to notice And there's also a kind of implicit understanding that it's a privilege to not be online, right? Humans all need refuge in some ways. And I have had readers say to me during events after reading about that, really reassess my relationship to my phone. I'm really trying to not always have this device that I'm looking to constantly and trying to be more present in the everyday. And that was pretty surprising because I see that as being a subplot of the novel. It's not the most dominant aspect of the actual themes, but it was cool for me to hear that, inspiring as well. I'm also trying to be less online and more physically grounded. So that's been interesting to see. But I think overall, there's an interest in climate fiction and an interest in thinking through some of these questions of the present through a futuristic space. It's been really exciting to have conversations with people about how a form of narrative speculation can allow that conversation to take place, and not for it necessarily be like, okay, this is a prophecy, this will definitely happen, but more so as a way to test out some of our current challenges or some of the problems we're facing, and to think them through the lives of characters and through the trajectory of story, which feels much more personal. I think for a reader, you really have a personal reckoning when you read a novel. You feel like you're hopefully inside of it and that you're implicated as well.
Was there a particular reaction, maybe from someone you knew well, that meant a lot to you?
The response from my family has been really lovely, in the sense that on my father's side, I do have family members who work in the oil industry. And of course, a lot of that was what drew me to the topic. It's why I was interested in writing about it and thinking about it. And so it was nice to kind of get the sense of this is a book that deals with those topics in a very different perspective, but then a kind of recognition of the validity of that exploration. So that was really great. I think for my students as well, I've received some really lovely feedback where they see that a lot of the conversations that we have in the class, they don't dissipate. They have their own kind of internal engine, whether it's in my work, maybe in their work, that goes beyond. And I like to think about the fact that that's actually possible, that conversation can create some kind of more concrete artifact, whether it's a novel or a song or some kind of account that extends beyond the ephemeral quality of conversation. That's also been really encouraging and has made me think differently about my writing in some ways, that there's more of a direct connection between my daily life and the far-off worlds that I'm creating.
So that leads me to ask how you consider your achievement now. And is there perhaps something unexpected about it? Maybe it's this continued residence, but it may be something else too.
I'm 1 year past the book being published, and so I am taking stock of what that experience was like and what it means for me as a writer. And I think what I've been really encouraged by is a sense of thinking of this book within like a body of work. I'm quite steeped into my next novel now, and that it's one aspect that encapsulated a period of my own thinking and the questions I was struggling with. And that period is now over. It's in the book. I'm moving on. I'm still working within a speculative frame, but into tangential topics. When you're writing your first book, at least for me, I was so inside of it. It was very, very difficult for me to imagine writing a second book, let alone a third. And even difficult for me to even imagine finishing it. But I think the seemingly encapsulated universal quality of writing a novel does end at a certain point. And you see your work in a different trajectory. And that's taken the pressure off for me in a way where I feel like I can explore different tonalities and different moods as well, while still hewing to some of the questions that I want to think about. But it doesn't have to be only this one book in perpetuity, thank God.
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but what role do you think fiction can play in helping us all to understand what we're up against with the climate emergency?
I think it can play a really central role. One of the challenges when thinking about the climate emergency is that it's a collective undertaking and yet it impacts people individually, right? For example, in this novel, there are a number of different characters who experience it differently based on privilege. There are some characters who are kind of safeguarded by their privilege. They won't really experience the gravity of it the same way, even though it does touch them to a certain extent. When you think about the climate crisis, there is already an inherent speculation that takes place in terms of climate goals and just global temperatures and the kind of benchmarks that nations are attempting to reach, but then unfortunately falling horribly behind. It can feel somewhat overwhelming to think about that. And fiction allows a very personal and to a certain extent subjective space to grapple with it. And it affords a level of intimacy, I think, as well for a reader to see lives quite shaped by this larger global catastrophe that may feel more tangible. So that's my hope, that climate fiction can do that. And I think some climate fiction really allows a kind of opening up of possibility. I hoped that this book would touch upon some themes that a reader could either respond to in a way where they might begin to conceptualize their own life as well. And the ending of the book is quite open-ended. There's like different possibilities that can emerge out of it. And that was a very intentional choice to show that the story continues. It's actually lived off page in a way, and to create that trajectory and that connection back to the present moment so that it didn't feel like it was too displaced and separate and only existing within the pages of a book.
And it's a very different way for the reader to think than when they encounter figures in a newspaper about sea level rise or temperature increase. You see it in the lives of these characters in your book. So we're coming to the end of our time together. We have some questions which we always ask our guests, and so I'm going to put them to you. The first one is, what is the most surprising thing you've learned from being a writer?
I suppose I knew this based on being a reader, was how intimate reading a novel can be. I've had readers say, your book was in my dreams. There's this kind of way that a book can go beyond a physical boundary. And not, of course, books have different impacts, so it's not specifically about my book, but that it can touch people in surprising ways. And I always wanted that for my writing. Of course, you want to touch readers and connect to them, but I never knew it would be possible. So that's been very surprising to me. But also, it's funny, you go through the period of promoting a book and talking about it and thinking about it, and then you just return back into the space that you were in before, which is this very separate, internalized space of creation and reflection. I found a huge amount of solace in that as well, and I didn't expect that it would feel both familiar and different simultaneously.
Sticking with the theme of surprise, what would people be surprised to learn about you?
I think I'm simultaneously introverted and extroverted. I'm a person who really enjoys talking to other people. I love cities. I love being in groups, observing people, all the nosy things of a writer. But I'm also someone who really needs my own space and time in order to reflect that as well. I don't know if that would necessarily be surprising, but that there's a kind of internal contradiction that exists within my personality that possibly a lot of, some other writers may experience as well, which is having to have one foot in the real world, but also one foot within your own space too. And that contradiction is a space in which I can create characters and settings and write narratives. I'm not sure if that applies to other career paths in the same way as much. That aspect of it has always, it's surprised me.
What's your idea of perfect happiness?
Wow, these are not subtle questions. Perfect happiness. I'm really taking a moment here to think about this. Maybe this is just utopian, dystopian writer in me. I think perfect happiness is something that I've never really thought possible to attain in an unequivocal objective sense. I'm always looking for some kind of contrast or shadow or some element of it that shapes it. And I think that for me, I think even that like posture is like a form of perfect happiness, which is thinking through some questions or possibilities and seeing them from different perspectives. So for me, perfect happiness might be multi-perspectives, which just sounds very vague and annoyingly writerly. But it's that there is a kind of destabilization of truth in a way, that there's no singular easy answer, but there are many different ways you can look at something or think something through.
And it's the darkness that shows us the light.
Exactly. The idea of shadow and contrast, you need that. Otherwise, if you're staring at pure bright light, you would be literally blinded by it. No one can look at the sun.
What advice would you give to anyone who wants to express their creativity?
I would suggest that you find a question or a subject or a topic that you are obsessed with to a point where you think about it. It's not something that comes subtly, I guess. It's something you're going to be quite fixated on. Partially if you work on something like a novel, just because it's such a long, drawn-out process. It requires like a long view and dogged determination. But also that you don't necessarily take this intense, heavy subject or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be intense or heavy too seriously, that you see there's lightness and dexterity to it as well. And then there's pleasure and joy in whatever it is that you're creating. It can have serious, heavy themes, but there is something about the actual act of exploration and creation that is incredibly powerful and really fun to a certain extent, too. So find both.
In one word, always a challenge, how would you like to be remembered as a writer?
Dexterous.
And our final question, and I think you know a little bit, it sounds like from what you've been saying, what would you like your second novel to look like?
I want the second novel to, it'll have some sort of similarities, I think, within speculative near future frame as Camp Zero, but that it's a smaller story. It's more of a story of domestic drama, but with the larger socio-political themes impacting that family. So Camp Zero is really about a broad, swath of characters who come to one place and are impacted by that. But this is the inverse of that. Maybe it's just like working on a second novel, and where I'm at right now in terms of my own interest and thinking, I'm quite curious about how our individual lives and desires are shaped by these seemingly disconnected political events. So it's essentially about looking at a micro depiction of characters who are subject to these larger forces.
Well, I am very curious to read it, and I wish you all the best of luck in the writing of it. Thank you so much, Michelle Min-Sterling, for joining us on Les Rencontres podcast. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was such a joy. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Rendezvous littéraires Rue Cambon podcast. To discover more about it, you will find images, links, and references on the Chanel website. À bientôt!